So we're going to continue then looking at John's Gospel. We find ourselves in chapter 11, right smack dab in the middle, which puts us right in the middle of John's Gospel. There's 21 chapters, and we are in basically 10 and a half here. So chapter 11, we'll be looking at the second half. But just to review for those who haven't been here, we talked about John being particularly the one whom Jesus loved. He calls himself that. And he has several things that he's done for us to help us in our belief. One is he has these signs, the signs that Jesus does. And today is like the sign for sure when he raises Lazarus. He has the I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and life. And so those I am statements help us with belief and help the readers in the first century about belief. He uses the theme of light and dark. We talked about that. He uses eternal life. Some other places it says salvation, but John uses eternal life. Think of John 3:16. They will not perish but have eternal life. And of course, John uses repetition. He repeats things for our, so that we would know that he is the Christ. So he does a lot of repeating. And then, of course, especially that you would believe. He wants us to believe. And that becomes his thesis statement in chapter 20. He wrote these things. He couldn't write them all, obviously. And he says that the whole world couldn't contain all the books. But he writes these things that we may believe he's the Christ. And I want to read a portion just to help us out from a letter of 1 John, probably written about 90 AD, after the Gospel, in the Epistle of John, which is toward the back of the book, 1 John chapter 1. He says this, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, we have seen with our eyes, which we've looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us." So even in his epistle, he's telling us this is the Christ. I've seen him. I ate with him. I laughed with him. I shared 3 years with him. And basically, he goes on from there. So he says these things that we may believe. So, first half of chapter 11, which was 2 weeks ago, we had this setup where Jesus, we're told, loved Lazarus and his sisters Martha and Mary. And then we're told that Jesus was told Lazarus was ill. You think, well, he's ill, he's going to go help him. But no, he purposely stayed 2 more days where he was before he went to Bethany. And they were some distance, some miles away from Bethany. And then finally he has to tell him, Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. He told him this wouldn't end in death, but yet he dies. And so there's a confusion there about what's going on. John tells us that. But this is all for the Father to be glorified, the Father and the Son will be glorified. And we have to remember that God is sovereign over all things. Everything's in his timing. Everything is at his will. And the importance then of the words to Martha, which ended the first half of chapter 11. He says, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And he looks at Martha and says, do you believe this? And her answer was, yes, Lord, I believe you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so let's look then, kind of jump into the second half. Let's look at verses 28 down to 32 of John 11. And John writes, when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and he's calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So as soon as Martha made that declaration, you're the Christ, the Son of God, she went in and got her sister, Mary, come and see. He's asking for you. The teacher's asking for you, and he wants to talk to you. And so, remember, he had not gotten yet to the village. They were still a distance away, and Martha had gone out to see him. So the teacher's here. He's calling for you. And so along with Mary and all those who were in their mourning with her, they get up and they go out. So there's like an entourage going out to meet Jesus on the road coming in. And we think about that where it's a blessing to have those sharing your mourning, sharing your grief. And we can be a blessing to others by sharing in their grief. And think about what Paul writes in Romans 12:15. He says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. We think about Job. Remember the first 7 days his friends came and they just sat with him. And they probably consoled him and patted him on the back and just sat. And they were helping him. And then they opened their mouth and everything went downhill from there. But to sit with your friends and share their grief is a blessing. And Christians need to be part of that. So the text says that Mary fell at the feet of Jesus. See, she's overwhelmed with grief. She's hurting. She needs comforted. And we can discern from the text then, and we go back and look at that story in Luke 10 where she sat at the feet of Jesus. Mary is more tender-hearted. Martha is the practical one. Mary is the tender-hearted one. Martha is the one that wanted help to do this and wanted everything to be just right. And Mary is the one who is more tender-hearted. But the words that she tells Jesus are the same. Just like Martha said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then it's interesting, John doesn't give us any more words of Mary. That's the end of Mary's talk here. And so let's look then at verses 33 to 37 as we move closer to what's the tensions building in this story. So verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Interesting comment. We get a view then of the humanity of Jesus here, do we not? We see the tender sympathy of his heart towards his people. When he saw Mary weeping and the Jews who had come with her weeping, the text says he was deeply moved in spirit. He groaned in his spirit. The ESV footnote says he was indignant. We think of being indignant, it's almost like an anger type thing. So let's look at this a little bit. The old Bishop of Liverpool, J.C. Ryle, from the late 19th century said, this is an expression of his emotional response to the adversities of human life and the power of death. It also showed his kind sympathy for his friends who were grieving. So Jesus is really showing a response of anger, disgust toward death. It's an enemy he's about to overpower when he raises Lazarus, and one he's soon to destroy in his own resurrection. But there's still an anger there toward death, and there's still a tender heart toward those who are grieving. But in the sense here, there's looking at the Greek meaning, and there's kind of a duality going on here. Jesus is also upset at the degree of unbelief of the people. So he's, tender toward those who are grieving. But in this culture, those who were the family would hire professional mourners at times. They would come and play the flute, and they would lead the laments and the cries. And so there's a sense there, it's almost sometimes a theatrical production that goes on. And this would contribute to Jesus being troubled in spirit. So now they direct him to the grave, and he's surrounded by mourners, the sadness of death. And John writes that Jesus wept. He shed tears for those who were grieving. His friends were hurting. And then there's another commentator, you may have read some Matthew Henry. He's a Puritan commentator from the 1700s. Matthew Henry's helpful here. He says, we can learn from this that Jesus Christ was really and truly human. Susceptible to impressions of joy and grief, Christ gave this as a proof of his humanity to both senses of the word, showing that as a man he could weep, and as a merciful man he would weep before he displayed his proof of divinity. So he is fully God and he's fully human. That's the point here. So think about this as well. Jesus Christ now sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. But he still has the glorified body. We will see him again, and we will have that with promise of that same body. And as he sits in heaven next to the Father, he still has the same heart. The same tender heart that beats for those who love him. And keep in mind, when he lived among us, he could weep. And so that brings me great comfort as I thought about this, that, he lived among us. He knows our trials. He knows our problems. He knows our tribulations because he lived them. So think about that as you think about the humanity of Christ. You don't want to forget that. He was fully human and fully divine. So it says that the people there commented on his show of emotion. Look how much he loved Lazarus. He loved Lazarus, can't you tell? But of course, there's scoffers in the crowd, always scoffers. Couldn't the man who gave sight to the blind have kept Lazarus from dying? Certainly he could have. If he could have done it, he would have done it, right? So evidently he's not who they say he is. Maybe he's not the Messiah. Maybe he's somebody different. Maybe just a prophet. And I read that, I kind of chuckle to myself. I said, just wait a few minutes. You're going to see for yourself who he really is. So let's then look at verses 38 to 44. And this is where, the tension begins to build. The drum rolls in the background. The music's getting a little bit louder. Verses 38 to 44. It says, then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Remember, Martha's the practical one. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you have sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. There it is. Lazarus has been raised from the dead. And verse 38 tells us that, again, he's deeply moved. He's deeply moved in spirit when he rises to the tomb. Now, this is probably because they were doubting who he was. They were doubting what he could do, the Jews who were standing around and helping. There's always that pointing the finger that he's not really the Messiah. And so there's kind of when it says he was deeply moved again and troubled in spirit, it's a word like troubled inside. And that was the accusations that were being thrown against him. Remember, he scolded the Jews for always wanting to see signs. If we look at in Matthew chapter 12 and 16 both, he said this. He said, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah. So two things there. First of all, Jesus is confirming the Old Testament prophet Jonah, that he was indeed 3 days in the belly of a fish. And that's the sign. He'll be 3 days gone and then he'll be raised again. So that's the sign of Jonah. So it helps us then even to encourage us with the Old Testament as we look at these stories that some people doubt and scoff at, that Christ himself affirmed that position. And many Jews in his culture would bury their dead in caves, either caves that were natural caves or caves that were constructed and hewn out of the rock. And then they would put a stone in front of them. That was, of course, the way Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. He was put into a tomb that same way. And so when they get to the tomb, Jesus asked for the stone to be rolled away. And then Martha says, no, Lord, he's been dead 4 days. There's going to be a terrible odor. And if you ever read the King James, actually at this point it says, he stinketh much. It's kind of hard to read that with a straight face, but that's what the King James says. 4 days dead, lots of decomposition. And that's why they would come and cover their bodies with aloes and incense and such, and then wrap them to try to keep the odor down, the decomposition from being overwhelming. So anyway, Martha didn't really understand when Jesus said that he will rise again. She didn't kind of grasp the whole thing that he meant right now. And so, we think about Christ being the Word of life, the creator of all things, and nothing is impossible for him. And so even healing the sick, raising the dead, he can do that. And so he answers her in verse 40, did not tell you if you believe, you would see the glory of God. She's getting a crash course in Jesus' school of faith and belief. It's time to believe now, Martha. You're going to see something. So Martha nods her approval, and they roll the stone away. And then something interesting happens. Jesus prays to the Father. He prays to the Father. And I looked at that, and it's interesting, and we have this prayer listed here. Commentator D.A. Carson commends this prayer for several reasons. He says three things about it. He says, first of all, that the prayer of Jesus to the Father demonstrates that he is doing nothing by himself, but is totally dependent and obedient to the Father's will. That's the first thing. Secondly, the prayer assumes that Jesus has already asked for Lazarus to be resurrected, to be raised. So Jesus thanks the Father for the answer. If you go back and look at verse 11, back we did last time, remember verse 11, he says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And so it's already like it's been determined. Jesus already knew he had asked for this to occur, and the Father's already nodded his approval. And so he's thanking the Father. This is what is going to happen. And then third, by praying out loud publicly, he said it here that I want everyone to be part of this. I want everyone to see that I am dependent on the Father. He sent me. I'm obedient to him. And I am truly the Son of God. So all those things are wrapped up in that prayer. It's an interesting way to think about it. And we see now what's going to happen. Verse 43, there it is. Jesus cries with a loud voice. Very simple. Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, come out. And maybe in your mind, you're thinking back when we did chapter 5. In chapter 5, verse 25, Jesus said, the time is coming, an hour is coming soon. And it's already here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. This is an example of that. And he's speaking possibly of this, and then looking forward to that day when he calls us all from our graves if we're gone when he returns. But those who hear the voice of the Son of God and those who hear will live. And you may have read this. I'm sure we're familiar with this story. Some commentators have said that Jesus has so much power that if he had not singled out the name Lazarus, that all the tombs would open up and everybody would come out. That's the kind of power that he has over death. So Lazarus does indeed come out. He's dressed in the grave clothes. And Jesus gives that command. Unbind him and let him go. Death can't have him just yet. It's not time. So take off the linen strips that were binding his legs and his arms. And Lazarus once again among the living. So he was called to restoration of mortal life. Now, the reason I say that is to compare and contrast with Christ's resurrection. Lazarus was raised back to life as if it were you and me. And Lazarus later went on and died. We don't know that story, but he was human. He was not a glorified body. So he died at some point later in the future. Christ, on the other hand, was raised with a new glorified body, a resurrected body, like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. It's an indestructible body. And so we see the accounts, particularly in John, when they looked inside and they saw the grave clothes there and the face cloth covered up, folded neatly and put there. Lazarus was still in his bandages. He was still wrapped up. But Christ had a new glorified body. He simply left those grave clothes behind. See the difference? And so for John, writing this gospel, he had these signs. And this is like the climactic sign, the seventh and climactic sign of it. But there's one greatest sign that's still coming. And we'll see that later on when we go a little further. But this is all to tell us that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. So let's look at with that behind us now, some interesting things are going on behind the scenes with the Jews. So let's look at this last portion. Read that 45 to 57, and we'll talk about it just a little bit. So it says, verse 45, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it's better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. And Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. That's their ultimate goal. Got to get rid of him. So on several occasions in the first 11 chapters, we've seen after Jesus had done something that says many believed in him. Many believed in him. However, we read in this passage that some went and reported to the Pharisees what he had done. And that was a pretty amazing thing to see a guy come out of the tomb. Remember, we said 4 days dead. There was no hope. And here he is. He's alive. And so the Jewish leadership, they're in a panic. This is panic mode. We don't know what to do. They're wondering what should they do. So they called together the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling council. The 70 of them all got together, composed mainly of Sadducees with some Pharisees, and they're all going to talk about what we got to do here. And we read their concern there in verse 48. We'll go over it again. It said, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Wow, would that be a terrible thing? Right? Everyone's going to believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. It's our place there, they're talking about referring to the temple and their way of worship. They were going to lose their prestige. They were going to lose their status in the community. And because of that rebel Nazarene, he's coming, he's stirring everything up, and the people are going to revolt. And Rome will come and destroy everything. What do you think about that? I don't think that there's a threat. If the gospel spreads, it's not going to bring bad news. It's going to be nothing but good news. And so this is untrue, accusing the Christians. And Jesus said, Christians should be the best citizens. Remember the account, I think it's in Matthew. It's probably in other gospels too, but where they asked him, who should we pay taxes? We pay taxes to Caesar? And he said, let me see the coin. Whose likeness is that? Caesar. Well, they give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So Christians, we pay our taxes, right? We're supposed to be good citizens. He said, don't revile evil for evil. Don't turn on people. Turn the other cheek. So we're to be kind. We're to be loving. We're to be tolerant. And so Christians should be the best citizens of all. Because Jesus taught us that way. And then think about Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. What did Pilate say? I find no fault in him. I find no fault in him. He's innocent. He had to be innocent. So it appears the enemies of Christ, both 2,000 years ago and even today, often cover their hatred and hostility with an apparent concern for the public good. We got to do things for the common safety. They branded Christians as troublemakers, right? Those who want to change the status quo of society and turn the world upside down, these Christians, they want to change everything. I don't want to get rambling too much here, but that is the case. They point at Christians who follow Christ and who believe in this book, which is full of truth, that we're rebel rousers and that we cause problems. And that's just not the case. So anyway, Caiaphas here. Caiaphas, who is high priest, steps in. And it's kind of interesting. All these men of learning around him, and he says, you know nothing at all. He declares to him, you don't know anything because I'm the high priest. Don't you see it's better that one man die than the whole nation to perish? Wow, isn't that interesting? Interesting concept. John then adds that Caiaphas, he didn't come up with that on his own, but he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into the children of God into one, all those who were scattered abroad. So Caiaphas determined it's politically expedient that Jesus must be sacrificed in order to salvage the Jews' relationship with Rome. Even though he's totally innocent, he's got to be taken care of. And that will get the Romans off our back. That's what's going to happen. Verse 53 says, from that day on, they made plans to put Jesus to death. We got to get rid of him. Remember, all through John's gospel, they were trying to get him. They're going to stone him. He disappeared. They're going to throw him off the cliff. He just walked away. His time has not yet come. It's getting closer, but still not here. They can't find him. But I want to point something out about the sovereignty of God. Well, we always make a point to say, God's in charge of all things. He's sovereign over all of creation. In his providence, things come about by his will. So we look at the Old Testament, for example, and we see that it was prophesied, especially in Isaiah and such, and that God was going to use the Babylonians to judge his people for their idolatry, etc., for their wickedness. And so he does. Read about that talk about Ezekiel, especially. It's very graphic in Ezekiel what's going to happen. And so he takes the Babylonians, he uses them, and then he turns around and judges the Babylonians. So he uses their wickedness for his purposes. And we see here the Romans are going to bring about the execution of Christ. That does indeed happen, as God intended it. And then in 70 AD, the Romans come in and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. So their Jewish nation will perish at the hands of the Romans. So God can use evil for his glory. He doesn't create the evil, but in his sovereign will, he can use that for his glory. Because God is holy. He's infinitely holy and righteous and just. Very merciful, as we see all those attributes coming together here. So hearing about the plot against him, Jesus withdraws to a town north of Jerusalem called Ephraim, and with his disciples, he stays there until the Passover. And this will be the final Passover. This will be when he makes his way. And when we get to chapter 13, we have that extended teaching from 13 through really into chapter 18. The teaching the disciples in that final upper room discourse. And so he's there, and there's some Jews arrive early in Jerusalem. There's a ceremonial cleansing, purification rites they had to go through for certain people. So they come about a week early, and they're looking for him. What do you think? He's going to come? Maybe he's not going to come. We don't know. But we know that nothing's going to happen until the Father permits it. It's all in his perfect timing. But for that Sanhedrin, Jesus has become public enemy number one. If you went in the post office in Jerusalem, his poster was up on the wall. There he is, public enemy number one. We got to get this guy. He's going to cause all kinds of problems if we don't get him. Verse 57, this is how it ends. The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders, if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so they might arrest him. And so that, again, the tension's built to this point, and it stops right there. John doesn't tell us anything more. We get to chapter 12. Next week, we'll see an interesting thing takes place. There's a banquet that's kind of special. And so that's the end of chapter 11. I don't know if you had any questions or comments.